What did you always want to be growing up? An astronaut? A teacher? An athlete? Well, for me, I always wanted to be a fireman. But then I found out it's actually super dangerous and doesn't pay very well. So I changed my dream, and now I want to make games. But a small part of me still wants to be a fireman. You know, just without any of the risk. So what better way to do that than with a game? So here's my plan. I want to make a multiplayer game where you play as a little fireman who is running around putting out fires and growing the town around you. So most of the game will be you frantically running around town putting out fires, but then you get a little break to place new buildings down and buy upgrades. Now, admittedly, making games is hard. You can spend years making a game without even finishing a demo. Could you imagine doing that? Well, for this one I'm going to have a better strategy, and that all starts with building up the base mechanics that I can build everything else off of. And what better place to start than the third-person character controller? Yep, I definitely won't come to regret that almost immediately. Anyways, I wanted to start with the camera. I figured this game would look way better with the top-down perspective. Think Overcooked with its frantic running around. This angle lets you see your surroundings much better, which will come in handy when you start aiming and dragging a hose around. Speaking of aiming, I just use a raycast from the camera that moves an orange dot to show where you're pointing. Think of it like a laser pointer. However, I didn't like how this felt. Since to aim up and down, the camera had to get really close behind the player and kind of ruin the top-down perspective. So I changed it so that the camera only moves side to side and the dot would move up and down on its own. This felt a lot better to me. Then came the hard part. Now that you know what you're aiming at, how do you shoot water to that spot? And this stumped me for a while. I had to go back to my high school days and learn about projectile motion. I was looking through old physics lectures, Khan Academy videos, all just to learn the math. And I figured out to solve this equation, I had a lot of variables I needed to figure out. The target distance, the target height, the launch angle. That's just way too much to keep track of. So I decided I needed to change my strategy. So I had the idea to, instead of having the water aim for the target, I would just move the target to where the water would hit. So your up and down aim would actually just change the launch angle of the water. My first attempt at this was to send a testing shot out every few frames that would move the dot on collision. This technically worked, but it looked really jittery and would get stuck sometimes. So I ended up breaking down and doing some math. I'm not going to bore you with the code, but just know I used the default physics equation and just changed the value of t to get the points along the curve. Then I cast a raycast in between the points until it hit something. Then it would just move the dot to that spot. This worked really well, and with just the spraying mechanic done, I'm already having fun playing around with it. Now for the main gimmick I've been holding back from you. I want the water to push you back when you fire it. This will not only make it harder to aim and put out fires, but also gives you some cool movement options. Think Mario Sunshine. But there was one major problem, the character controller I used. In a normal case, you could just add force to the player, but since the player is using a character controller instead of a rigid body, that isn't so simple. This would be the code if I used a rigid body. Yep, it's literally that easy. And this is the code I had to use because I was using a character controller. This is awful, don't use this. So basically, I had to keep track of how much velocity should be added and then manually slow that down over time since physics wouldn't be affecting it. This was really annoying, but I kinda got it working, so I'm gonna move on. Then for the other gimmick. I want the hose to hold you back kinda like a chain. If you're running around the city, I want it to get stuck on buildings and other things, so you have to think about all your movements and have to double back to fix it. And of course I got this working on the first try. Okay, it wasn't so simple. Yep, you guessed it, this is also because of the character controller. The hose is made up of hinge joints all connected together to act like a chain, so it uses physics to do everything. So of course the character controller doesn't work with it. So you know all the progress I've made so far in this video? Scrap it, I have to make my own character controller that uses rigid bodies. I tried to make everything act the same, which is nice, but definitely makes me feel like I'm wasting time. But at least the hose works now. Well, almost. I had to tweak a bunch of settings, but it should work perfectly now. But I want you to be able to upgrade the length of your hose during the game. Currently the hose is just a long cylinder with a bunch of bones in it. This means whenever I add an upgrade, I would have to make a new model and set up every bone again. This wasn't going to happen, so instead I decided to dynamically spawn the hose in, and this actually went way better than expected. I just use small cylinders as the parts of the hose, and I can just enter the number of links I want and it will spawn them in and connect them all. Then I just have to have one end attached to the player and the other end stay locked in place. Now, this might seem to work fine, but it did cause another problem. Since the chain has weight, the player is only able to move so many of them. And if you think turning down the weight is the solution, you'd be wrong. This actually causes the chain to break again. So I had to think of something else. Eventually, I landed on just turning off gravity for the hose. This allows the player to move correctly, and since the hose is linked to the player, it almost acts like gravity's on it. It is a little floaty, but if you ignore that, it's perfect. And now that the player's finally set up, I can start making the buildings light on fire. But since I'm just working on the mechanics, the buildings will be cubes. I hope that's okay for now. I set up 4 cubes that can spontaneously light on fire, or in this case, turn red. This also activates the fire gauge at the top. This is basically just a health bar that always looks at the camera, but instead of health, it tracks the fire damage. This will slowly go up over time, but if you shoot it with water, it'll go down, and once it hits 0, the fire will be put out and the building goes back to normal. Or orange. So with all the basic mechanics done, I think there's time for one more thing. Making the main character. Now art isn't my best skill, and the camera is far away, so I feel like I can keep it kinda simple. I took inspiration from Game Beast and made a blob-like character. It ain't much, but it'll do. I put him in the game and he's ready for action. He could use some animations, but since the camera's far away, I think it's passable for now. I did tweak him in the hose to be skinnier since I thought that looked better, but I'm sure I'll change it a few more times before this game's out. And now that I have all the mechanics done, in the next video I can make the actual game loop so you can really see my vision. So subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you guys then.